Gopal Art. As you know, this is a series which has been running since 2007, looking at art, and we have some very illustrious speakers, including Kumar Shani, Ranjit Hoskote, Geeti Sen, Dilip Chitre, Yashodhara Dalmia, Sadanand Menon, Pranav Ranjan Ray, Shomik Nandi Majumdar, Anirudh Chari, Nancy Adadania, Krishan Khanna and Gayatri Sinha. And the idea was that invariably most of us hardly spend time with a work of art. We watch it for a while and then move away. So this will afford an opportunity to be with either a piece of art or with an artist for a length of time, and to hear an expert. And we have drawn from various fields. As you see the list, it includes poets, and includes filmmakers, and includes, of course, art critics and art historians. And this time we have the youngest of them all. I think we have never invited so young a person as Dr. Rakhi Balram, who holds 2 doctorates. One should be bad enough, there are 2. And they are in French literature and art history from Cambridge, and one from Institute of Art in London. And she has specialized in modern and contemporary art. She has various publications on the aspects of 20th century art and literature. She's also contributed to Vivan Sundaram's Amrita Shergill, a self-portrait in letters and writings. This was published last year. And she's currently a visiting professor at Jawaharlal Nehru University. That's how we got hold of her and asked her to come and talk. And she will be speaking on Amrita Shergill's artwork, 2 Girls. You have been given a copy, thanks to Vivan, the reproduction, a card reproduction of this. So there you are. At the end, we'll have an occasion for a discussion, questions and answers, and we are requesting Geeta Kapoor also to intervene or coordinate the discussion in a more art historical manner than a generalist mind like me would possibly do. So there you are. First, Rakhi Balram.
In the groundbreaking 1972 edition of Marg, dedicated to Shergill, each of the Baroda School contributors, critic Geeta Kapoor, artist and Shergill's nephew Vivan Sundaram, and artist critics Gulab Mohammed Sheikh and KG Subramaniam, all attempted in some fashion to come to terms with the enigmatic work. Others be somewhat elusive. More recently, Hungarian Katalin Keserű tried to redress the balance by focusing on the works, singling 2 girls as revealing of the relationship, or as she ascertains, friendship, between Amrita's husband and cousin Victor Egan, Shergill to Frida Kahlo, another third world woman artist who carries the burden of representation as being emblematic of nationhood, although Shergill, who died in 1941, did not live to see independence. Kapoor further situates the work of Shergill as a precursor to later women artists in terms of the social issues of women via allegorized autobiography and female eroticism in the 1980s, India, as witnessed in Nalini Malani and Arpita Singh. Mexico, however, persistently knocks on the door of its first world neighbor, and readings of Kahlo are always slyly aligned in this context. While India's geographical position in world politics in this century, first colonial, then the birth of a nation, and then emerging power, is more complex and perhaps explains the late reception and the virtual invisibility of Shergill in the West. Or, as Keserű puts it, the triple barriers have cut her work from the world, the artist as woman, as Indian, and as Hungarian. Is Shergill's invisibility in the West in some ways tied to the complexity of discourse surrounding race, class and caste and gender, and sexuality that the drama of the representation in the image evokes? The imagery of 2 girls, one white and one dark-skinned, was modeled in Hungary using models of a gypsy and a European girl. The different skin colors evoke Shergill's dual heritage as a Hungarian and part German and Jewish mother and Sikh father. The double identity that Shergill shared, it may be worth noting that she had two names, Dalma in Hungary and Amrita in India, and the psychic bonding expressed through the gesture of the white girl's hand on her shoulder seems to express the kind of intimate bond shared through the finely wrought, fragile artery between the two girls, or the same girl in Frida Kahlo's portrait from the same year, To Frida's 1939. Geeta Kapoor and Partha Mitter have also suggested an affinity between the two images, which evokes a double identity as much as a cultural and racial hybridity. Such a layering adds another critical dimension to Two Girls, the tenderness and intimacy suggestive of a shared self and dual identities, although Shergill is crucially not the same girl. Both share aspects of the monumental and possible sources of sumptuous, lush salon and history painting in the Louvre. As Solomon Grinberg points out, the importance of Theodore Chasseriau's The Two Sisters and the earlier anonymous Gabrielle d'Estrées. This was Kahlo's first large-scale work. It was painted at a time of divorce, while Shergill's created just after her marriage. Although it may be tempting to draw too great a parallel in light of Kahlo's worldwide recognition, there are facets worth exploring. Kahlo draws upon a pre-Columbian tradition, her illness, her Catholic heritage, shared with Shergill, who was also baptized but did not practice, a mural tradition and surrealist influence, while Shergill relies on a successful academicism, although, as I argue later, influenced in part by Ajanta and other experiences in India. Such conscious play of feminist subjectivities are worth examining. However, in this light, as well as the role that childhood myth and the unconscious played in the formation of Shergill's work, an aspect not earlier considered in the body of Shergill criticism and now open due to the recent publications of her writing and letters. Bathing, Narcissus in the Reflecting Pool. Hungarian folk tales and fairy stories played a part in Shergill's earlier dreams and fantasies in the first 7 years of her life in that country. The influence of these stories, which she began to illustrate in colored pencils in 1919, bear the legacy of her first artistic forays and experiences. Photographs of the artist from the period pay tribute to the waters that abound in Hungary as a place of renewal and reflection. Images of the water and its seductive and sinuous silvery gilt edge becomes a mirror of her past as much as her future. In the early 1920s, back in Shimla, she remembers and writes of a rosy-cheeked Hungarian girl with large blue eyes and crystal waters of the Sisa River. She writes, it's out again. The rays of the sun burnt the earth, and the silvery water of the Sisa called the... That's better. Thank you. Burnt the earth, and the silvery water of the Sisa called the girl to have a bath in her cool waters. The beautiful girl came, she took off all her clothes, and she ran into the silvery water, and she cooled down her burning body. By the time she had come out of the water, the sun had started going down, its crimson rays painting the foam of the Sisa a golden hue. The poem continues. She braided her hair and put on her clothes. She rushed home and lay down in her white bed, and she dreamed beautiful dreams about her homeland. In the morning, she put on her beautiful white, flowery wedding dress. Her hair was braided with roses, and by the time she was ready, she was like the most beautiful flower, and she went to the church with a Hungarian lad. Ah, how happy was this most beautiful couple. The evocation of freedom seen in the young girl bathing or symbolically purifying before she lies down on her white bed and dreams of her homeland, and before the young girl marries, suggests a type of fairy world that conflates adolescent girl, nation, identity, sexuality with a happy ending through the merger of the beautiful couple, all the more striking in reference to the two girls painted at the time of the artist's own marriage to a Hungarian lad, her cousin Victor. For Amrita, who tried to pierce through such illusions with her critical mind, such images appear to reverberate in her work and attest to her own admission of a romantic and melancholy nature. Suzanne Valadon, a French artist contemporary to Amrita's time in Paris, and one she admired, produced coarse, sensitive nudes in intimate settings such as in After the Bath from 1909. Valadon, an illegitimate daughter of a laundress who also remembers her mother washing white sheets in the river, has special resonance in terms of the use of the white draping in Shergill's work. Shergill too has a photograph that shows the artist and her mother and sister bathing in Hungary with the image of a laundress behind them, recalling the differences between work and leisure and implications of class difference that the two girls, divided along race lines, also suggest. These histories, or the emptying out of a kind of history by water, signifies not only a return to the lost mother, or in Kristavan terms, to the womb-like chora and the fluids of the semiotic space, but also recalls the religious associations of Amrita's early baptism as much as the Hindu association of cleansing and ritual purification in water, which Amrita would have seen on her many travels. She writes to her parents from the shores of the Danube, quote, "If you saw me, you would get quite a fright, for my skin is of a dubious tint, jet black more than anything else, with a purplish sheen and a tinge of blue in it now and then, according to the lighting. I've never been so sunburnt. I'm well known all over Verochi, I don't know why. And this morning Baba told me that I am known on the strand as the pearl of the Maharaja, no doubt a delicate and slight allusion to the pearly whiteness of my skin." This mutability on the part of the artist and focus on light and dark skins also seems to subtend some of the critical questions of race raised by the two girls. Sorry, that was the slide with that. The motif, which was also evoked in salon painting in the early 19th century France, was seen in the work of Ingres, Chasseriot, and Delacroix's imaginings of the exoticized Turkish baths and the privileged European, while Manet's Olympia and the use of the naked white prostitute and her black servant also have origins with this work. Although the former depends on the space and context which Shergill's empties out with the use of the white sheet, recalling the watery silver edge as a backdrop in the painting. Academic painters of her time, such as Joaquin Soroyo in the early 20th century, also uses the theme of the playground of the water's edge, using women of two races and likely classes, suggesting the cosmopolitan mix of the water as potentially democratic and liberal utopic space in After the Bath from 1909. This is in stark contrast to the reception and the complex spectatorship that received the work of Hemendranath Majumdar in Bengal. His semi-wet and erotic nudes titillated to the point at which an editor who reproduced his images had to insist on a, quote, moral spectatorship that would take into account the pureness of the woman who was caught unaware. The difficulty of accessing the nude outside of live figure drawings, which the JJ School in Bombay, who under Solomon was promoting, was also lamented by Shergill during this time, who struggled to find nudes in India. The restriction in which Majumdar was met, as Partha Mitter points out, a contemporary 1930s writer, Sanjani Kamta Danta quipping, quote, "After Majumdar, our mothers and daughters hardly dared to go down to the local pond for fear of artists lurking behind trees and bushes," unquote, is in direct contrast to the culture Shergill was living in Europe. The dark and light skin seen in the contrast with this elite white portraits embody a kind of desire and exoticism that we see in images such as Dilika Laddu, that at once makes Shergill's immediately the more psychologically complex. This is to say that if there is a type of privileging of the omnipotence of the nude, or omnipotence of the male colonial gaze, I would like to suggest the sense of touch between the girls creates a kind of intimacy that threatens the objectification of that very dynamic. The use of the local gypsy was used earlier in the 20th century in the Hungarian Nagybanya school, which started as an artist colony trying to capture nature through direct perception, with adherents such as Istvan Reddy, who studied at the Académie Julian in Paris, showing a psychological sensitivity in their nude portrayals. Van Gogh, whom Amrita adored and frequently evoked, also referenced gypsies in his work in Arles. The deliberate position to politically and aesthetically privilege the marginal, a borrowing from Van Gogh, who was also looking to figures such as Jean-François Millet, the Barbizon School, the reproductions of L'Ermite in journals, and earlier figures such as the Adrian van Ostade in his work from Nuenen, is witnessed in works such as Shergill's accomplished potato peelers from the same period as Two Girls. Much like the latter painting, Shergill avoids all sentimentality and does not restrict her Hungarian work to what she loathed of making of her Indian paintings, that is, quote, travel posters. In this way, Shergill uses the potentially utopic possibility of tenderness, intimacy of friendship as a bridging between classes, between the European and the Gypsy, between the center and marginality, all the more poignant in the face of the Second World War. This critical decostuming, one in which Frida's self-portrait relies, or masquerade, evades specific questions of class, if not power. If Proust, whom Amrita in her letters insisted on bringing on her 1938 voyage to Hungary as the only book she would carry, describes the scene of young adolescent girls on the seaside in Baalbek, famously marking one for her straight nose, her dark complexion, pointed in contrast amongst the rest, like in a Renaissance picture of the Epiphany, a king of Arab caste, another by cheeks in which the pink had that coppery tint which makes one think of geraniums. This is Proust. Now I'd ask you to look at Shergill's work. Features in the Sea of Girls. The emotion is one of wonder of their intimacy, modernity, and insensitivity and vulgarity through the perception of the author's own alienation. Have you look at this image of Amrita as well, surrounded by her sister and cousins. Okay, I'll read this out. This is Proust. Though they were not separately identifiable, still the mutual response which they gave one another with eyes animated by self-sufficiency and the spirit of comradeship in which were kindled at every moment now the interest, now the insolent indifference with which each one of them sparked according to her glance, fell on one of her friends or on passing strangers, that consciousness, moreover, of knowing one another intimately enough always to go about together by making them a band apart, established between their independent and separate bodies, as slowly they advance, a bond indivisible but harmonious, like a single warm shadow, a single atmosphere, making of them a whole and homogeneous in its parts, as it was different from the crowd through which their procession gradually wound. The girls' intimacy and solidarity at the exclusion of the male voyeuristic spectator in this charged landscape. Proust writes, quote, "The girls also benefited by the alteration of social values characteristic of seaside life. All the advantages which, in our ordinary environment, extend and magnify our importance, we there find to have become invisible, in fact, eliminated. This made it easy for strange women generally, and today for these girls in particular, to acquire an enormous importance in my eyes, and impossible to make them aware of such importance as I myself might possess. The modernity of emotion in the pose models of the two girls at the expense of the alienation of the viewer, their intimacy, the hard look in the eyes which Proust sees as characteristic of a type of modern adolescence, is the psychology at the heart of Two Girls. The image of bathers and bathing, amongst Cézanne's most revolutionary works, launched experiments in cubism, and which Amrita would have known is highlighted through the kind of fusion of subject in inner nature, if not with outer world. The art historian T.J. Clark pronounced and positioned as an enlightening corollary to Shergill's own depiction, quote, that if I saw it necessary or possible to psychoanalyze Cézanne, I would hazard the guess that in his case, the late bathers were his effort to reconstitute a world of sexuality which, at some level, he had never left. Although to some extent Shergill's use of the two models is, as Deepak Anand points out, a suggestive erotic trope to point out the use of les deux amies, or two female friends, in the 1920s and 30s, and one that would be common to academic paintings, Shergill's own admitted interest in bisexuality, as she famously wrote her mother, fearing pregnancy and disease and growing irritated by the mixed signals of her friend Marie-Louise that, quote, she thought she would have a relationship with a female when the opportunity arose, unquote. In the bohemian circles of Paris, as much as about the freedom of sexuality as an integral part of being modern, with Black American erotic and exotic Josephine Baker and the gay and lively and freewheeling Paris of model Kiki de Montparnasse, the latter to where Amrita escaped from her parents' more soigné address, that is Montparnasse. Images of the period show bohemian life and artistic circles being carried out by the surrealists who sought the erotic encounter as a means of unleashing the repressed unconscious that not only spat in the face of bourgeois values, but would also lead ultimately to political revolution. The surrealists, such as 1937 photograph of Paul Eluard's German wife Nush and Man Ray's Filipino girlfriend Adi, attest to the erotic force of the same-sex encounter. Such images were foregrounded more formally by composed photographs, such as Man Ray's Black and White, 1926, created at a time of the negrophilia in Paris, where all things black were valued by artists and intellectuals for their eroticism, exoticism, and primitive power. This is the Paris of Shergill, where she chose deliberately to wear a sari to create a sensation and as much stir as possible. Although her method was academic in training, her subject matter showed hints of a modern adolescence seen in Proust and the permissive sexuality that would not reach a wider mainstream middle class until the 1950s, with figures such as Brigitte Bardot and novels such as François Sagan's Bonjour la Tristesse, and the later adolescent homosexual encounters as depicted by Violette Leduc. Shergill did not form part of the Parisian avant-garde. Rather, Shergill seems to be reacting in part to her perceptions of India. Shergill's open rejection of the values of the middle-class, conservative India is cultivated in a type of modernity by which being modern included sunning herself black on the beach, as did her white European cousins, and then, of course, regretting it. This is not the avant-garde Paris of figures of the late 20s and early 30s of Claude Cahun, aka Lucy Schwab, openly homosexual and cross-dressing surrealist photographer, whom when frequenting cafes and to André Breton reacted in distaste by hiding. Rather, the sexual energy is poised and latent, and the strange world of her contemporary Balthus is recalled, with their weird adolescent sexuality, broken and fragile, asymmetrical and awkward, as belonging to another genus or species, where latent, uncontrollable sexuality seems to warp the content and world in which they find themselves. Some of this energy could be shared by Shergill's two girls. The burning of the white girl's pubis with a cigarette stub by an outraged Indian spectator, and the mark is still evident, in a 1972 exhibition in India, has the suggestion of penetration by the male viewer too rich to miss. Politics, asymmetries. According to Vivan Sundaram, the work Two Girls would have been created in March 1939. The impending war was growing increasingly close, and Shergill responded by trying most insistently to obtain for a passport for her and her new husband to emigrate to India, calculating how quickly she could get out of the country. The artist, whose husband was militarized as early as the fall of 1938, was somewhat protected in the rural Kishkunkulas, where her husband had been stationed as a training doctor. However, the anxiety grew more intense when he was once again deployed on their return to Budapest. The war clouds became more ominous, however, in Budapest, yet Shergill cheerfully, if a little callously, notes that Victor could now buy the medical equipment of the Jewish doctors forced to depart in 1939 due to the restrictions made on the Jewish professionals by the fascist collaborating Horthy regime at, quote, wonderful prices. Shergill, part Jewish herself, didn't seem to identify too closely with the race, earlier enforced in some part by her mother, who was noted not to broadcast the fact. The problem with identity became more pronounced in Budapest, where Shergill wrote in January 1939 to her worried family, possibly to reassure them that, quote, "You need not be afraid that I shall go to jail in Germany. I shall wear saris to avoid misunderstanding. But even the blind can see I'm not a Jewish type, but an Eastern type. How often they stop me on the road to ask." The oppressive wartime mood, which Shergill limits in her discussions, likely to not worry her parents, and secondly because she was obsessed on getting the deposited family money from Germany and secure her papers in order to leave the progressively dangerous situation. Two Girls, created in this charged atmosphere, seems to suggest an asymmetry, but also an underlying unity and reassurance. The standing white girl places her hand protectively around the seated darker girl, suggesting a psychical alliance through increased vulnerability. Shergill seemed to distance herself from India as much as she reinstated it. Her painting Winter from 1939 shows the formal elements that seem to inform the color of Two Girls: a controlled palette and restricted emotions, which she attempted in a Hungarian village scene with its northern Bruegel-like influences, which did not turn out nearly as, quote, gray, white, and black, unquote, as she would have liked. She remarks to Karl Kandavila a statement of prescience that seems to inform two girls, quote, I cannot control my appetite for color yet. I fear and wonder if I ever will. Do you think I should? Unquote. This, along with her statement that she hadn't done any sculpture, but the urge is there, also seems to account for the later work. If Shergill showed her emotion in part through color, the restraint and purging of colors shown in the work cannot be divorced from the climate of fear and uncertainty and loss of control that her Budapest period suggests. It's worth remembering that Shergill left for India on the advice of Lucien Simon, her teacher, who suggested that Shergill go to India precisely because the gray colors of Europe did not suit her. Devoid of country and history, it seems to anticipate the works of Maurice Blanchot's use of space and silence, while acknowledging the importance of realism decreed by fellow Hungarian Lukács. This is to say that an asymmetry of power and powerlessness it seems to blank out or white out a kind of history in a Shoah or catastrophe. Devoid of context, the painting becomes solely about the tenderness of a kind of emotion, which Shergill manufactures through a youthful sensuality and self-assertion that we see in Balthus, nubile adolescent bodies rendered more vulnerable by prefiguring the horrors of war. The monumentality of the figures show her progressive interest in the scale of the human body and sculpture, which she mentions again on its likely completion in a cryptic note, quote, I finished my large picture at Edith's. Perhaps on her return I will do some sculpture in her studio, unquote. She also noted the arrival of the long-awaited and needed German money that would secure her passage back to India. Like Guernica in 1937, Picasso's masterpiece, which also was drained of color and conceived in black, white, and grays, to better depict the cold tragedy of war and the violence specifically against Basque women and children, is Shergill, who likely knew the work through reproduction, attempting an avant-garde palette, one devoid of her usual vibrant color, by posing sensitivity and femininity as a foil against fascist political regimes. I think her letters may not suggest how much the climate might have been affecting her, she admitted in trying to protect her family to Karl. The answer may lie in India. The hybridization seems not only about race, femininity, vulnerability, and threat, but also about shifting axes and terrains. Critic Kathleen Caseru notes that although a gypsy model, the skin was too dark to be so, and the politics of repressed memory and longing and the possible pitting of her work against the policies of the colonial regime or the recovery of a divided self. India. Even while in Budapest with the situation worsening, Shergill's focus was on India. Her ambitions rested on returning there safely with her husband. She was also aware of her father's role back in politics in Shimla. With the symmetries of power turning towards an increasing fascism and a growing spirit of independence and Swadeshi politics back home, to what extent did Shergill construct two girls with the spirit of Indian independence in terms of politics and modernism in terms of aesthetic in mind? Could the seated girl swathed stiff white fabric, half pulled around her shoulders, be seen as khadi, the natural homespun fabric of self-rule? Shergill's views on nationalism were complex and mediated by her positions of caste and class, although in this respect her family was radical in her aristocratic father's support of nationalism to the point of being disinherited, a source of constant tension and money problems in the Shergill household. He was a strong follower of Gandhi and took points to meet him personally, with Shergill expressing her resulting dismay in a letter that he did not describe the encounter in more detail. Shergill admired Gandhi. She saw him in Trivandrum in January 1937, and she decided not to seek a personal meeting with him with so many followers there, at once expressing a sensitivity, but also typical of Shergill in securing her elitism and not wanting to be one of the crowd. She was certainly aware of his message. Her intimate friend, English journalist Malcolm Muggeridge, had been publishing his correspondence with him, and Shergill's now famous few meetings with Jawaharlal Nehru, whom her father quietly hoped she would marry, are now legendary, though their topics of discussion, other than her art, remain largely unknown. If there was a political intent, an acknowledgement of a colonial asymmetry on the part of the colonizer, as expressed by the white girl, and the colonized, as expressed by the seated darker one, there would be a political statement about the vulnerability and inherent strength of India. Did she anticipate the parallel between a growing fascist regime and the colonial rule that Gandhi was later to equate in the Quit India movement? Two Girls thus represents an accord in time of discordance, when significantly Two Girls was created against a backdrop of national politics being mediated by two men. Taken at a time of independence, and very critically minus Edwina, this is not to over-determine the moment, but point to possible unconscious and further sources in the asymmetry of this work. It was in March 7th, 1939, the same month that Shergill was working on the painting, that Gandhi ended his fast with the urging of the Viceroy's letter, and Shergill may have been aware of the sensitivities of such a politics of liberation and the importance of mediation as a harbinger of things to come. Bharat Mata. The influence of India cannot be denied in Two Girls, although critics cite it as a European work, in part because it was created and completed there. Shergill's trip to Ajanta in the winter of 1936 was a critical experience in her artistic development, that she was working not to imitate a critique she aimed at what she felt to be the derivative Bengal school, but rather to assimilate. Some of the aspects of the assimilation of the mural painting are evident in the figure's elongation, differing skin tones, indicating Varna, and the standing girl's vacant eyes. What is most disturbing about the portrait may be the strain of eroticism, the dépouillement, or the stripping of figures devoid of culture and context against a white backdrop. The loss of context and the white curling sheet backdrop, which earlier I posited as seeming to echo the banks of a pond or river, seem a way of concentrating emotion and narrative in much to Shergill's extreme critical dislike of Abanindranath Tagore's wash technique of the Bengal school. The feminine Shergill decried of the Bengal school, seen in the Pramanani proportion and Lavanya and fusion of grace of Abanindranath Tagore, was, as Parul Dave Mukherjee discusses, in contrast to the masculinization of European painting in the style of Shergill. Thus, a study of form becomes the form of the nation. Shergill already stated that she believed the Bengal school, quote, lacks the power to interpret the India of today, unquote. While it is true that Shergill consciously tries to break with the wishy-washy mandates of the Bengal school, at times through Ajanta or otherwise, she appears to reformulate their concerns. As she writes to Karl Kandalavala, I would like to embrace you when you say things like post-impressionism having a fundamental analogy with the Ajanta. It is so true. They are of the same family, just as so-called modern Indian painting, which claims to descend from Ajanta, is really Salon des Artistes Français, the most academic and worst salon painting. This is not to say that Shergill gives an unambiguous account of nation and motherhood. The erotics of her work, specifically in Two Girls, seem to uphold a feminine through subject matter that bridges class and race in a type of erotics that threatens chastising childbearing republics with the subversion of power through the intimacy of adolescent female desire. This would be in direct contrast to her own Bharat Mata, Mother India, 1935, where Shergill consciously linked nation and motherhood through a fragile, wizened woman and her child. Such a spirit was crystallized a year later in Jawaharlal Nehru's vision of India in his 1936 autobiography, where he described the Bharat Mata as, quote, sad-eyed and forlorn, but a beautiful lady, very old and ever youthful in appearance, while asking, quote, does the beautiful lady of our imagination represent the bare-bodied and bent workers in the fields and factories, unquote. Such a socialist view of woman upholding the nation belies the intense personal relationship of Two Girls. The latent homosexuality implied in the image and suggestive of Amrita's own personal experiences takes on a slightly different meaning when viewed as a different and irresolvable parts of her own being. This position, defined psychoanalytically a few years earlier by Melanie Klein in her work on the depressive, places the infant subject as ambivalent due to the inherent schism in the relationship with the mother as manifested in the good or bad breast, one which gives and the other which withholds milk. And I would suggest that in the iconography, where you have one breast that's shown and the other hidden in the figure of the seated girl. The duality of this position and the difficulty of its resolution gain resonance between the half-covered left breast of the seated girl, whose cloth both partially hides and reveals one breast. This is a very different view of Bharat Mata as ethereal goddess, floating, transcendent, and sacrificial mother that Abanindranath presented earlier in a different time and context, that of heightened nationalism in colonial Bengal in 1905. With the four arms or multi-limbed goddess in Tagore reconfigured here, I would suggest, into the bifurcated split of the two girls. Although one circulated in a popular context and was created in watercolor, borrowed in part from the Japanese, and the other was meant for an elite and conceived in European oils, a tension prefiguring war and resistance is shared. Tensions of form on the one hand and the washing out and persistence of a European context on the other is seen in an increasing surge towards nationalism. This is a duality left in constant tension and left undetermined. Thus, the unifying call of the mother suggested by Abanindranath's vision is left as schizoid, according to Klein, and without resolution, constantly pushing between the poles of good and bad. This, I would suggest, was part of Amrita's essential relationship, not just to the art of her time, but to contemporary Indian aesthetics, which Amrita characterized in these exact terms, that is to say, good or bad. Amrita's revolt, as we have seen, was not part of the contemporary European avant-garde. It often was in rebellion in tune with what she so strongly seemed to detach herself from, in which she was embedded. The legacy of the Bengal school and its style and rhetoric, and middle and upper class values of India itself, fought with tools borrowed from the post-impressionists 40 years earlier before. Her revolt was more in line with the bourgeois Indian values and challenging them through her work as a woman artist than with the European avant-garde, who was trying to break boundaries aesthetically and politically, while at the same time struggling with the same questions of form and representation in the defining of an Indian tradition, which through its prescience and complexity, along the twin lines of the feminine and the national, she ultimately achieves in a devastating confrontation with herself and an unresolved assimilation of aesthetics in two girls. Thank you.
And now is the time for comments. Comments need to be brief, and questions, if any. And
You'll be standing or seated?
I'll sit.
Back to the last seminar, which I have seen in your paper. But one thing, the post-colonial period, that could you see that it is unforgettable, our contribution to the, especially to Indian scene?
So are you asking about post-coloniality and whether or not that plays a part in...
We are unforgettable about our contribution. We have special reference when she migrated to India.
Yes,
If she continued in Hungary,
yes,
she might have faced the repression from the Nazi forces. which is
yes,
there.
yes.
And now we can see the imperative impact after visiting Ajanta and after comparison of our paintings. That's why I want. Is there any indication from your study?
I'd like to leave that as a comment, if that's all right. Yes, thank you.
I thought, if you don't mind, I'll
Please,
keep intervening. The last issue that you raise, or the last painting that you take of Abanindranath,
You're right.
Mother India,
Yes,
and this is the most startling thing.
yes,
in one
yes,
sense.
yes,
And you're reading back into your first thesis about the national
right,
through now an iconography,
Yes.
which I don't think has ever been posed before as a possibility. So, sorry, I've got a feedback now. Would you just elaborate for our purpose? Because I think
Yes.
we might need just a little further elaboration of the good and bad mother that you are bringing up here in
Yes.
psychoanalytic terms.
yes,
And then you're reading it formally.
Yes.
So I'd like you to go back from the two girls to Abanindranath and just elaborate. You've already brought it up, but maybe you can elaborate.
elaborate a bit further in
On to the
relation.
way that you want to relate, so you go from Abanindranath to Amrita.
Right.
I want you to go back from Abanindranath, from Amrita back to Abanindranath to see what what we might do with that reading of Abanindranath.
Yes. Oh, in terms of the Melanie Klein and the psychoanalysis and the good and bad breast in relationship to Abanindranath's image. Well, I was locating that particularly in a kind of subjectivity or Amrita's subjectivity, perhaps in relation both in terms to the nation, to Indian aesthetics, and possibly to motherhood. And so I think that's the notion of Melanie Klein there is specifically limited to this example, or that's how I wanted to use it. But imposing the two together, what I wanted to bring out was this notion of an emblematic womanhood at a point of crises, one in terms of partition in Bengal, and the other with the war being slowly culminating in Europe, and also the relationship between what was happening in India in terms of sort of trying to slowly break the shackles of a kind of colonialism. So I think that it's in that way, it's in terms of the politics and at the time that the two images were construed, that I would like to bring them together. But I would like to leave that a bit open as well. Again, that's something that I think is startling and transparent.
In other words, would there be another reading of Abanindranath's Mother India if you take this detour?
Well, in terms of Melanie Klein, at least, I think the fact that the chest is covered makes it slightly difficult to read it through iconography, at least that way. But if there's a subtle reading to be had, I think that would have to be more nuanced, and it would take some thinking about to read that back onto Abanindranath and what that might suggest. But do you have an idea?
No, it's startling to see.
Okay.
I won't be able to respond. Questions? Surely there are questions.
Before arms.
Yes. Yes.
And the contrasting nature of each arm and body does resonate with Indian aesthetics in the sense that each arm is given in Indian iconography is
Yes,
given
of course.
a different power or incarnation. So very interesting juxtaposition.
Yes,
Just thinking about the earlier the earlier painting of Amrita, in which Indira is sitting, and I think Marie Louise is there, and there's a painting. So that's,
Oh, yes, yes.
Yeah, so I forget the title. Because there is a kind of a very different kind of eroticism, maybe a homoeroticism in that painting, but of a different nature entirely. And when we think of this painting so many years down the line, it's got a kind of restraint. It's got a kind of, again, it goes into the areas of using thing as a symbolic gesture, one. And I think the second thing is that because she relied so much on models to paint, and I guess it's because the models are adolescent, the painting is because of, it's two girls who are adolescent. But I think everything else, it's because of she did not find or they were, so it just, I think it's a chance that these models are adolescent and therefore the painting is of two girls. I would read that it's, that there is, and therefore the whole, the structure of the painting is more symbolic in that sense. So, and just my comments and your comments on that.
You think that the nature of the eroticism is different in the earlier image in part because there were personal relationships in painting sort of sister and Denise. Yeah, is this
But I would like to suggest that, because at that time she is not, Ajanta and all
Yes,
these other
yes,
forms of
yes, yes.
making art and, a kind of symbolic register on which you can, paint has not entered her work. So everything is right there, the eroticism is there. But in this, it's mediated through all those other forms. So I guess, but
where do you
not
see?
restrained.
Yeah, through the formal qualities of the painting. You see it as more symbolic.
Yes.
Huh, yeah, okay. No, I'd like, yes.
I just have a very
Go.
curious thing
Yes.
about in this painting. What has always struck me is the blue eyes,
Yes.
which are not,
Yes.
which don't have pupils, and I've always been kind of really disturbed by that one detail in the painting, and I don't know if there's anything.
I think there might be a reference to Modigliani there, possibly. But I liked the fact that it could be also Ajanta, because I think with time the eyes are elongated in the same way as the standing figure. Although that blue, there's something to that blue. I agree. It's a phenomenal blue. Yeah.
You actually do mention it.
In terms of the water, do I mention?
Yeah, I just wondered if you wanted to speak a little bit more about it. You mentioned the vacant eyes.
Yes, the vacant eyes, which I think too has a mask-like quality. And if we think of figures like Picasso, who was looking at kind of Iberian and African sculpture for Les Demoiselles d'Avignon, maybe there is something mask-like in the images, in the faces of these two women, certainly, and Modigliani very much within that vein as well. Yeah. I don't know if Ajanta was ever proposed in that light, but I thought I would try to do it today. So.
Yes, just say
Please.
something. Here we are in this wonderful gathering, trying to unravel the various meanings that could be attached to this thing. There could be meanings and meanings and meanings, and we could go on ad infinitum. The painting remains as a central focus. Naltop was a painter, right?
Yes, yes.
That in fact, it embodies a whole lot of things which we think we can unravel. But in point of fact, the picture doesn't give assent to that. It remains as a kind of a monument within itself.
A sphinx.
Yes, it does, and I think it does have that particular kind of quality which wants you to unravel, and yet you don't unravel. Really, you go around, and in fact, a lot of this unraveling can be very subjective on your part. And
Like Draupadi's sari.
Oh. I think you do mention that in your 1972 article in Mark, don't you? That the enigmatic qualities are there. Yeah,
Because
it
we
is.
never come to the end of
Yes, yes.
I mean, you can go on talking about various influences and go on
Yes.
talking about Mother
Yes.
India and,
Yes.
and
Yes.
everybody else.
Yes.
I mean, it can sort of bring out many images.
But isn't that, in part, its psychological complexity?
But I think that's a part of the victory of the painting.
Yes, true.
That I think that
True.
the picture succeeds. It doesn't reveal itself absolutely completely, and it never will.
Rocky, can I ask again?
Yes.
I thought that you might do a very detailed formal reading of the painting. Over the years I feel that this might be the most accomplished, the most successful, the most complex and resolved as painting that he ever did. So if you would situate this apart from a kind of iconography and the ramifications of that iconography both in Europe and in India, which you've done fantastically. If you were to speak just formally about this painting, would you arrive at certain kinds of art historical connections which are different from the ones that appear from an iconographic reading? In other words, would you elicit different kinds of configurations of the language in the mid-30s in Europe, whereby this would be read not in terms primarily
Yes.
of its iconography, but in terms of its formal position. And just as a postscript to that, sorry.
Give water. Speak.
She mentions Modigliani, of course, and we don't know what relationship could have or would have had with Balthus, So would you bring in Balthus here? Or Modigliani is actually a simpler painter of all
Yes,
this
yes,
painting.
yes.
I think that he's a much simpler painter, particularly in relation to this painting. But what about Balthus?
I referred to him in the presentation, but there's something. Yes, yes.
Just elaborate what you might think, either Balthus or anybody else that you would elicit from contemporary art history of the time.
To some extent, in looking at this painting and looking at the art historical context of the 30s and even into the 40s, I think that in some way she prefigures the kind of drama that we see in Balthus. Much of that kind of very distorted adolescent kind of sexuality that is seen in his image, and I've shown you one, but much of that work is something that actually happens during the war and later. I think that as far as my research goes, I think that the Shergill work is unique for her portrayal of two women in this sort of fragile guise, in relationship to one another, and at a point of an outbreak of war. And the only figure that I could see that in some ways mirrors that kind of complexity, and in some ways I could iconographically captures that is Balthus. But there are not that many. I mean, that's why I think this painting in some ways stands alone in that respect, and the depiction of women, and which is why I turned to Proust, to be perfectly honest, to try to capture that complexity, as opposed to finding another type of formal reading in terms of art history.
You do a formal reading through the use of
Yes,
the cloth.
was, yeah.
The cloth and its allusions to water and so on.
Yes.
And to, but that's a formal reading which again works into an iconography.
Yes.
So I just wondered in terms of the language that she's using, and it is extraordinarily advanced within the terms of what certainly women artists were doing.
Yes.
One could only possibly account for 2 or 3 important artists in the up to the 30s.
But-
Maradon you mentioned.
Yes.
And Paula Morrison.
Yes.
There are 2
Yes.
poets.
Yes.
And Frida then,
Mhm.
obviously, in a more direct allegorical reference.
Yes. For the
Look, the contemporary
Yes,
picture,
yes,
isn't it?
yes.
Or because perceptions are same.
I'm sorry, is the Majumdar and the...
Perceptions are same, or because they are contemporary, or what was the comparison reason?
I was trying to point out the actual use of the nude and the way in which Majumdar tries to capture the woman outside on the banks of the river in almost something that's titillating and in some ways I think tries to entice the viewer. It's very much for the male spectator, I think, the Majumdar images. Whereas I don't see that same thing happening in the Shergill. I don't think it's necessarily meant to appeal or to titillate a kind of viewer. The women are both nude, certainly much more nude than in a Majumdar, where you have them in the sort of draped wet sari. But at the same time, there's something that I think Ghulam was pointing out, that there's something unavailable about the two women, and I tried to also mention the point at which a sort of possibly frustrated male viewer had taken his cigarette and actually tried to burn the pubis of the standing white girl, as if to penetrate something that's impenetrable, something that shuts out the gaze of the male spectator, I think. So.
Painting?
Yes.
The aspect of black and white and the fact that you had the kind of audacity to bring in Guernica,
Yes.
and the kind of the violence that was around and happening,
Yes.
very traumatic moments because of the rise of fascism. So this is one of her paintings where she almost entirely removes color. It's obviously
Yes.
in black and white. The other point that in terms of again what Peter asked, or the kind of formal analysis of the work, is that I've always thought of this as a kind of post-cubist work,
Okay.
this painting.
Yes.
And the reference that she made, just I think only once where she used the word cubist, is when a painting of her sister, the reclining nude, which again is on a white sheet, and it has relatively very little color, says that and they didn't like my painting in Hyderabad because they thought it was too cubist. So I'd like for you to elaborate, or if you have any comments on my observation of how this would be a post-cubist work, You did bring up this aspect of black and good and bad, black and white, of the black, the African aspect which the surrealists picked up the Man Ray, that primitivism, that almost everybody asked the question that this ambiguous form on the left-hand side,
Yes, absolutely.
is it something to do with some abstraction quotation of this, the kind of African, the other, something mysterious coming into this painting? I mean, you can also completely make it very neutral and matter of fact that it's a table and there's a lampshade, half a lampshade on it. So it's just something very matter of fact. But it's the way that it creates a very strong structure, and then how in fact she plays this positive and negative, what is absent and what is present, and how actually the remarkable way that what you described as the white khadi robe against a white background. I mean, that's really something very challenging that she's able to kind of to transcend and to give that a kind of weight and monumentality. And that in this, finally, when you look at the painting, in particularly
Exertion.
Intimacy or exertion, could you speak about aspects of
Some of these issues. Okay.
of this very kind of space and how these figures within that operation?
Well, I think it's interesting. I'll try to work myself backwards from your comments, but the much to that idea of Proust and the geranium blush, or the geranium, that sense of health, vigor in a young woman, something that was very indicative of a modern kind of adolescent. And I think that's witnessed here, and I think the pink is a kind of sign of health and yes, and mobility even, socially or sexually or otherwise. Your other comment about the work being cubist, I think if I had to think about that, it would go back to the École de Paris, the Atelier Lucien Simon, the kind of atmosphere that she would have found herself in Paris, where cubism was still the dominant kind of model. Now, the question about the mask, right? In the Man Ray, yes, I think the black mask in some ways, and contrasted against the figure of the white woman, in some ways suggests that unleashing of a kind of erotic desire that's not within one, but that is somehow standing next to one and embodied in that figure of the black African mask, the other that somehow stands for the self. I'd like to say that. Okay. Anything else? We could talk after. Sure.
Posing the models and painting. I mean, I think it's quite special. I think we should take it beyond the academic starting point that it has, and extend it a little bit more into what would be a performative. And actually, to look at it, that would be, I think, for me, that remains very much a way of decoding a lot of things. And I wonder whether you have interesting.
I'm very intrigued by this notion of the performative. Do you think that there's something more you could say? Where you're pointing to?
Putting figures there, it's not because she can't paint them otherwise, but she's putting them there and making a make-believe of her. She's making it enact for her.
Mm-hmm. As opposed to a self-portrait?
As opposed to maybe it's an extension of the self. But in a way that it goes out into an actual performative mode, which I don't know how many artists of her generation or of the kind of reference. I just like to know more, a little bit more, what you think about it. Whether there would be comparisons with other artists who use models, or to to me that is definitely a kind of way of understanding what she's doing.
Do you think that in some ways she's positioned these two models in a type of performance?
This is charade.
There's an aspect of charade, you feel? I think that in some ways,
I mean, we talk
Yeah.
very often about the internal life of these paintings. I
Mhm.
think we need to project it out and see it as a playing out.
yes, but isn't it a playing out of perhaps either her own internal concerns or anxieties, or
Yeah, that we know, and we know it's been talked about and we understand. Also, there is an interest in characters that she has. She likes people. She knows. I mean, that for instance, the woman lying down with
The woman in Chhattisgarh.
that woman in Chhattisgarh.
yes,
And she's interested in all these characters in whatever way. And extending from her own, interest in the model, which must have been it's quite a thing to be keeping on and on painting. You do it as a portrait, you do it as a study, but then to actually take it into making of art, making of sort of complex emotional.
yes. I mean, I suppose that I get the sense that you think that there's something of jest. Is it a kind of jest, or is there a sincere? Is there something insincere? You feel, or it's not that? It's just a position.
I wouldn't put that kind of value thing to it. I mean, I would put it as a mode. I mean,
Now
I think that I would like to. That's something I'd
Yes.
like to learn from.
Yes, I think I need to say something. Please, yes,
Learn to do.
yes. I see what you're saying. Yes, yes. That it's much more academic and then, yes, yes, yes,
And
yes.
she had to evolve and to discover that for herself, and that's what happened.
I was wondering, 1939,
Yes.
Nazism, America is hungry, trying to get
Out.
out to India. Whatever I have studied of Amrita, I don't think she was a very politically conscious painter. To compare her with Amarendra Tagore, who consciously fashions a political iconography in the form of Mother India, seems a little unfair, and if I may, even far-fetched. To read political messages in this painting appears to me very, very far-fetched. Yes, you can read a lot into black and white. You can read a lot into the mask on the left side of the painting.
Yes.
And that has not been sufficiently discussed. We can look at the mask on the left side of the painting purely as a formal element which helps in structuring the painting and
Yes.
creating a certain kind of visual balance. But that by the time Africa was very much a part of the consciousness of Europe,
Yes.
we can also look at that not only in terms of the black female figure, but the presence of this mask, which obviously, to me at least, has a male presence. We can also look at it in that way. So I was personally of the view that a comparison with Abhinandanatھ Tagore is, to me, a very, very far-fetched thing. Thank you.
Okay, so in part I would respond by saying that, yes, I agree with you insofar that this painting was not created to be...
This painting as a political gesture within the feminist discourse. And also you showed Majumdar's painting and you have Abhinandanatھ. This is the only one that actually steps out as a very, very radical departure from either the mother of Abhinandanatھ and the whore figure of Majumdar's women, which are clearly...
I don't know, whore, but yeah.
Well, within the feminist discourse, I don't mean it in the dual mother
Yes,
kind
fine.
of figure
Yes,
that's,
yes.
that's played out in art. The second thing is actually a comment that Ivan had once made, which really struck me, is that the way that the darker girl has been made in terms of her proportions, if she were to actually stand up, she'd tower over the white girl. That is just an interesting sort of way to look at that power relation, perhaps. And the third thing is really a question about the iconicity. If one were to imagine that the white background was like a backdrop, a curtain perhaps, and also the sort of not meeting the eye, the way they are posed, again the sort of performativity of the icon, which is for me disturbed by that ambiguous shape. So far from balancing the picture, it actually then, the title of your talk, Fearful Symmetry, for me, that throwing it into that sort of not knowing what's going on, or that symmetry actually breaking. Just comments, I don't know where I'm going with this idea.
No, I agree with you. I think that aspect of the curling line, which I was trying to relate, to aspects of the unconscious, to the silvery gilt edge of the water that she had grown up in, bathing in Hungary. I was trying to find perhaps resonances that might explain that particular gesture. But yes, formally it does seem to break the symmetry somehow. In terms of feminism, it's difficult to sort of place this painting within that category. It's feminist, certainly, yes, but very much the kinds of terms we're thinking is post-dates this particular image, and yes, and yes.
I think this sometimes look like this dark woman trying to submit apology, doing something wrong to third woman, so
that she's apologetic.
Directed to submit apology,
yes,
or to feel guilt, something like that.
That the seated figure appears guilty of some act. Yeah.
Being directed to submit apology or to
feel.
Yeah.
Yeah, possibly, yeah.
Can I indulge in a little
Yes.
bit of detail?
Yes, please, Vivan.
Cropped in this image, where as you move down to that white shape,
yes,
it becomes a beak, a sharp
yes,
point.
yes, you showed me in the picture.
And, you can read that, and it's very deliberate, it's abstraction.
Yes.
To read what you like.
So you think it's a kind of phallic point there at the end that splits the two women.
And it could be
yes, in that way, possibly. Yes. Cop there. Yes, it's fine. Yeah, we can.
That brings us to the end of the first part of the evening. There's a later part, which you no doubt know. But thank you very much. I think apart from a brilliant presentation, we had a very interesting discussion. And more importantly about possible meanings and the possible intimations that a work of art and a major work of art create in all of us. And thank you very much for participating. And those who remain silent, thank you very much for listening. Because you must be meditating hard. But now you deserve a drink. I'm enjoying it.
Yes.